All right, hey guys, back. We're dealing with the second of Simmel's videos now. And this one is on association, which is his way of talking about interaction. To put it in the context we were talking about from last video, this is his second tier. Remember, the first tier is about individual consciousness. Second tier is going to be about, okay, so now you've got a bunch of individuals, bearers of the life process, and what do? So they interact. This is probably what Simmel is best known for. It's not my personal favorite of his stuff, but it's the thing that he's kind of most cited for, I guess. When he appears in intro to sociology textbooks, it's often in the context of his work on interactions and specifically on the differences between dyads and triads, which we will talk a little bit about. So Simmel believed that that people could only be understood in relationship to one another. Remember that whole methodical relationism thing. Everything interacts with everything else, and you have to understand it as pieces of a puzzle. So whereas Weber was like, people make meaning, for Simmel, which is similar to Mead in this way, yeah, they do, but it's in relationship to other people. Where he differs from Mead is that he is not as interested in the content, the specific meaning attached to things in a particular interaction. He doesn't deny that that's happening, but that's not what he's interested in. He's interested in what are the different, what is the form that interactions take. So what we're going to do is deal with kind of three different aspects of his studies of interactionism: forms, types, and social geometry. We'll start with forms. Forms basically means the different sort of ways of describing an interaction, regardless of the content of it. It's an interaction form, like the idea of a boss and an employee. But he would go more general than that. He would say it's superordinate, subordinate. Anytime that you have two people, they could be equals, or one of them could be higher and the other one could be lower. And he says that that would be a specific form, and that things would play out in much the same way, whether that is teacher-student, boss-employee, coach-player, that you'll see commonalities, that the form imposes on the people in a way, regardless of the content. And what I just said there, I actually kind of improvised, but it's an important thing that I was going to talk about. He says that that we just are confronted with way too many different specific interactions, and that human beings go through their lives and they categorize them. So this is a what he would say a superordinate subordinate interaction. And he says that we might not use those words, but we're aware of that, and we will react in the same way in those situations. He would say, I will treat my kids in a similar way that I will treat my students, and in a similar way that I will treat my players that I coach, because in all of them there's this commonality of superordinate, subordinate. So he says this is how we approach the world. We may not be always consciously aware of it, but that's absolutely what we're doing, because there's just too much. Otherwise, you couldn't have every interaction just be undertaken with only the particularities of that situation. We categorize so that we can make sense of it and manage our lives a little bit more easily. But this is the thing that I said before that is important, and because remember, Simmel's big overarching concern is this tragedy of culture, the idea that we create objective culture that then imposes on us. Well, this is what's happening in these forms. I create this idea of this is how a superordinate-subordinate relationship works. So I've created that. I've invented that. But now, every time I go into one, that structure, that piece of objective culture dominates me. I behave according to it. So whereas at first I am the bearer of the life process transcending normal life, thereafter I'm a subject of it. I'm imposed upon and dominated by the thing that I created, which should probably remind you a little bit of Marx's discussion of reification. Simmel uses that same concept of reification here as well. The types of forms that, this is probably not an exhaustive list, but he talks about subordination, superordination. A different form than that is exchange, which implies at least some degree in that moment of equality. He talks about conflict, which is different than exchange and different than superordination, subordination. And he talks about sociability, kind of just being a sociable person, as all different forms. And what he would say is, we categorize our lives according to those, but then they impose themselves on us. That's it. That's what we got for forms. And then, importantly, this is where Simmel sort of sometimes can get lost, where people can get lost in the weeds of Simmel, is he'll talk about a billion of them. He'll write about a whole bunch of these things, and then it's left to the reader to kind of piece them all together with, okay, so how did this all fit into a kind of a general conception, which I think does him a little bit of harm in terms of getting him onto the A-team. Second are types. So forms of interaction, types of interactors. So what he would say is when we go interacting, we categorize people and we interact based on the category. Some of the categories that he talks about are, I don't know why I find this kind of amusing, but I do. He talks about the miser, the spendthrift, the stranger, the adventurer. But you don't have to think about just that limited set of types. The idea here is that we interact with people not as individuals. We interact with them as based on the type that we categorize them under. And once we've created those types, then those types impose themselves on us. They limit our behavior, which is, in my opinion, and interactionism is not my favorite part of Simmel, but that is a pretty cool insight. That's it for types. Third, social geometry. Here's where things get really kind of funky with him. So he's really talking about the mathematics of interactions. He talks about how the numbers are important, that moving from a dyad, a group of two, to a triad, a group of three, creates all sorts of different possibilities in the interaction. He says in a group of two, there's no independent group structure. It's just the relationship between those two people. But you add a third, and all of a sudden there becomes a groupiness to it. That's not a word that he used. A structure, that we're a part of this thing, that in a group of two, he says at least, doesn't work the same way. He says that you can be, and I find personally I don't completely agree with this, but this is what he said. Your individuality is not threatened in a pair. But in a triad, because there's this group structure, your individuality can be threatened in that context. And once you go from 2 to 3, then the step from 3 to 4 is not as big. The step from 4 to 5 isn't as big. All of those have group structure. All of them have a loss of individuality that 2 doesn't have. He just says that the critical step is getting that third person in. But he also says getting a third person creates the possibility of new social roles. So if you started out with these two people, this third who's in the middle right now could be a mediator between the two of them. When you just have two people, there's no mediator. If there's conflict, there's just conflict. With a third person in between them, this person can mediate, and that can change the way the interaction goes. He also says that this person can manipulate, could could try to drive a wedge between these others for his or her personal gain, things that are not possible in a group of two. So the numbers are really important to him. Again, it's the type of thing that once you see it, kind of isn't of course, but again, the first person to see it is kind of a genius. Okay, let me scroll down a little bit. With increases beyond that, he doesn't, to my knowledge, write about quartets or quintets. He may, but he's not famous for it. He had this to say about increasing group size in a general way. He says, while on the one hand, you do lose the possibility of individuality. On the other hand, there's more freedom. The more groups that you are a part of, the more each one of those groups can only kind of control a small portion of your personality. And so he says, as society grows and people can become members of more different types of groups, there's more freedom in your life experience from that, which is he thought good, because he's all about transcending the normal, and so the more freedom you've got, the better. He also said, though, that, and this is in the year 2021, when I'm recording this, he said that as it gets really big, masses of people are more likely to follow simplistic ideas and engage in mindless emotional actions. And I think we saw this, if you're watching this in 2021, you'll be aware of the fact that we just had domestic terrorist attack on the Capitol. There was a bunch of people yelling, "Stop the steal." And this is a situation that all objective facts pointed to a different conclusion. But what Simmel would say is, but you've got a mass of people. And the bigger and more complicated things are, the more people are going to be drawn to a simpler understanding of things. One of the things that Donald Trump did was he boiled things down to 3-word slogans over and over again. Lock her up, build that wall, stop the steal. There's no doubt that they are all stupid. They were all incredibly logically flawed. But Simmel's not talking about whether or not they're going to make the right decision. In fact, he's going to say that oftentimes masses are going to make the wrong decision. And then his third part of social geometry he talks about is distance. So in distance, the example that I'm going to use is the stranger. A stranger is a person that has to be close enough that you know them, you could point them out, but far enough that you don't know really anything about them. And he said this creates an interesting situation for interactions. To interact with a stranger is to possibly be able to disclose things to him or her that you might not be willing to disclose to somebody that you're closer to. You think about people, the things that they will say when they call in to talk radio shows, or a person interacting with a therapist. A therapist occupies this sort of type that is defined by distance. A stranger, you know them, you see them, you can identify who they are, but they don't have any closeness to you and your normal everyday life, and therefore they can be objective about you in a way that maybe your friends or family can't, and they are and you're willing to disclose things to them because it's not going to affect you in the rest of your life. So that idea of distance, again, kind of an amazing insight by Simmel. All right, I'm running long on these Simmel things because there's so much of it. So this is where we're going to end with our discussion of his understanding of association. It is important to understand that he did not see, he was kind of like Weber in the sense that, he's not a carbon copy of Weber, although the two were friends apparently. They wrote letters back and forth and their families did. He's like Weber in the sense that he doesn't think that society is a thing exactly. He said society is merely the name for a number of individuals connected by interaction. He said that as you increase the size and differentiation of those interactions, so we can think of it as increasing the size of society, but remember, he's not really talking about that. He says it tends to loosen the bonds between individuals, which makes some sense. And those it leaves in the place of those bonds more distant, impersonal, segmented relationships. It's harder to be really closely connected. All right, I'm over 15 minutes, which I hate. Next time, we're going to build from tier 2, interactions, into tier 3, bigger social structures, and we're going to introduce his concept of worlds. So I'll see you in that video.